They discriminated against her because of her body, without knowing she was the most powerful woman there. What began as humiliation by the pool became a revolution that shook an entire industry. Because sometimes, power hides beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, like and subscribe so we can keep creating stories like this one. The sky was cloudy that Monday morning in Riverside, as if anticipating the tension floating in the police checkpoint set up on Technology Avenue. Traffic Officer Richard Stern, known among his colleagues as the Hawk for his penetrating gaze, and his ability to detect the slightest infraction, observed the slow vehicular flow with growing impatience. His 20 years on the force had hardened him, turning his uniform into a shield that justified his severe treatment of citizens. At 45, Richard had been divorced twice, and his only comfort was his 8-year-old son Michael, who lived with him after a shared custody agreement with his ex-wife. Young Michael represented the only crack in Officer Stern's hard shell, though few knew this sensitive side of the policeman. As Richard adjusted his sunglasses, reflecting his annoyance at the clouds threatening rain, he spotted a faded blue Volkswagen sedan, at least 15 years old, slowly approaching the checkpoint. The vehicle was making a strange noise, as if the engine was begging for early retirement, and the smoke it emitted announced its arrival long before the car itself. Richard raised an eyebrow, exchanged a knowing look with his partner, Officer Rodriguez, and signaled for the driver to stop. Behind the wheel was a heavy-set woman, approximately 35 years old, dressed in a simple nurse's uniform under a worn jacket. Her hair pulled back in an improvised bun, and the dark circles under her eyes on her brown face revealed a night of work. Her name was Grace Henderson, though Richard didn't know that yet. Grace, a nursing technician at Riverside General Hospital, had just finished a double shift and was heading to her home in Highland Park, where her sick mother and 3 nephews awaited her. She had been raising the children since her younger sister had emigrated to another state in search of better fortune. Grace's salary barely covered their basic needs, and the old sedan inherited from her deceased father was her only means of transportation. "Documents, ma'am," demanded Richard with a deliberately harsh tone as he leaned toward the window, wrinkling his nose as if detecting an unpleasant odor. "And next time, try to pull over before blocking half the lane. Oh, and if you need help getting out of the vehicle, we can call the fire department." The comment provoked muffled laughter from Rodriguez, who observed the scene from a few meters back. Grace, without raising her gaze, extended her driver's license and registration with trembling hands. It wasn't the first time she had faced this type of humiliation, and she had learned that silence was her best ally in these situations. Richard, unsatisfied with the lack of reaction, began to inspect the vehicle with ostentatious meticulousness. "Is this noise normal? Sounds like you've got an orchestra of tin cans inside," he commented as he lightly tapped the hood with his pen. "And that seat looks like it's about to give up under so much weight." He continued with his biting comments about the condition of the car, Grace's appearance, and assumptions about her lifestyle, each word like an invisible but accurate dagger. "This smell, and is it from the car or, well, better not to investigate." Grace remained silent as if these words slid off a shell forged by years of discrimination. However, something in her serenity, a dignity difficult to break, began to make Richard uncomfortable. It was as if she observed him not with resentment, but with an understanding that disarmed him without him being able to understand why. When verifying the documents on his electronic tablet, Richard noticed something unusual. The system produced a notification linked to Riverside General Hospital. Intrigued, he touched the screen to get more details. What he read left him paralyzed. The medical record showed an emergency admission from the previous night, a child victim of drowning in the pool at the Riverside Country Club. The patient, Michael Stern, his own son, and there highlighted in clear letters, responsible for successful resuscitation, Technician Grace Henderson. At that moment, the world stopped for Richard. The woman he had just humiliated without remorse had saved his son's life barely 12 hours earlier. Michael had gone swimming with his mother and had sunk without anyone noticing immediately. When they pulled him from the water, he was already unconscious. Grace, who was covering an extra shift in the ambulance, had been the first to attend to him, applying resuscitation maneuvers that proved crucial for his survival. Trying to hide his shock, Richard looked again at the woman behind the wheel. Her serene expression now made sense. She knew who he was. She had recognized him from the beginning, but chose to maintain her dignity in the face of ridicule. Grace's silence wasn't passivity. It was a form of strength that Richard had never experienced. "You may continue, ma'am, and—" "Thank you," murmured Richard, returning the documents with a timid gesture. His voice broke at the end, betraying his usual hardness. Grace nodded slightly, showing no anger, pity, or pride. Only understanding. She started the old sedan and slowly drove away down Technology Avenue, disappearing into the morning traffic, leaving Richard motionless, immersed in a mixture of guilt, gratitude, and shame. "Everything okay, Stern?" asked Rodriguez, noticing the sudden change in his partner's attitude. "Did you know that woman?" Richard didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the point where the blue car had disappeared. "More than you can imagine," he finally murmured, storing the tablet in his pocket with trembling hands. The rest of the day passed like a fog for Richard. Each driver he stopped reminded him of Grace, and every word he uttered seemed empty and lacking purpose. At the end of his shift, he drove directly to the hospital instead of going home. He needed to see her again, although he didn't know exactly what he would say when he found her. But Grace wasn't there. According to staff, she wouldn't return until the next day. Richard returned to his apartment, where the babysitter confirmed that Michael was resting peacefully. He sat by his son's bed and observed his peaceful face as he slept. He thought about how close he had come to losing him and the injustice he had committed against the person who saved him. At that moment, something broke inside Richard Stern, something that had remained hard and inflexible for too long. The night passed slowly and tortuously for Richard. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's serene face contrasting with his own hurtful words. He got up before dawn, prepared breakfast for Michael with unusual care, and personally took him to school, something he rarely did. During the journey, he observed his son singing happily, unaware of how close he had been to a fatal outcome and the unpayable debt his father had incurred with a woman he had publicly humiliated. After leaving Michael, Richard drove to Riverside General Hospital. He parked his patrol car and remained for several minutes with his hands gripping the steering wheel, mentally rehearsing what he would say. Upon entering, he asked for Grace at reception. The nurse on duty, an older woman named Dolores, looked at him with distrust. "Technician Henderson, why is a traffic officer looking for her?" Richard hesitated before responding. "It's personal. I need to talk to her." Dolores narrowed her eyes. "She's in the pediatric wing, 3rd floor, but she's busy, officer." The tone made it clear he wasn't welcome. Richard took the stairs, feeling that the elevator would be too quick for the time he needed to organize his thoughts. Upon reaching the 3rd floor, he saw her immediately. Grace was leaning over the bed of a small child, adjusting an IV with precise and delicate movements. Her face reflected absolute concentration. Richard stopped a few meters away, paralyzed by a mixture of shame and admiration. In that environment, Grace seemed transformed, confident, competent, respected. Several colleagues greeted her as they passed, and she responded with a warm smile that Richard hadn't seen during their encounter at the checkpoint. When Grace finished with the patient, she headed toward the nurse's station without noticing the officer's presence. Richard approached slowly. "Mrs. Henderson," he said in a barely audible voice. Grace turned, and for an instant her expression revealed surprise before returning to her usual serenity. "Officer Stern," she responded simply, without adding anything. "Helse?" The silence between them extended, uncomfortable and full of meaning. "I would like to talk to you," began Richard, aware of the curious glances from the medical staff. "About yesterday." "I'm working," responded Grace, reviewing some files. "And there's nothing to talk about regarding yesterday," Richard insisted. "Please, 5 minutes, it's about my son." The mention of Michael made Grace look up. She sighed and pointed toward a small break room at the end of the hall. "I have a break in 10 minutes. Wait for me there if you insist." "So much." Richard nodded and headed to the indicated place. The room was empty, with an old worn sofa, a humming refrigerator, and a half-used coffee maker. He sat down, removing his uniform cap, feeling strangely vulnerable without it. 15 minutes passed before Grace appeared. She stood by the door, as if wanting to keep her escape route open. "You have 3 minutes, officer. I have patience." "Waiting." Richard took a deep breath. "I know it was you who saved my son the day before yesterday. Michael he's everything to me. And the way I treated you yesterday." The words got stuck in his throat. He had never been good at apologies. Grace observed him with an inscrutable expression. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she finally said. "It's my job. Anyone else would have done the same." "But it was you," insisted Richard, "and I treated you as if you didn't deserve respect. I want to ask for your forgiveness." Grace seemed surprised at this last word. She studied the officer's face as if looking for signs of falsehood. "You know something, Officer Stern. You're not the first to treat me this way because of my appearance, and you probably won't be the last. I accept your apology." "Anything else?" Her tone was cordial but distant. Richard shook his head, feeling there was something more he should say, but unable to find the right words. "How is Michael?" asked Grace, slightly softening her expression. "Good. Thanks to you. He doesn't remember much of what happened, which is a blessing." "Children are resilient," commented Grace, "more than many adults." A beeper sounded in the pocket of her uniform. "I have to go. An emergency." She headed toward the door, but Richard stopped her with a question. "Why didn't you tell me anything yesterday? Why did you allow me to humiliate you knowing who I was?" Grace turned slowly. "Would it have changed anything if I'd told you? Would you have treated me with respect only because I saved your son? And what about all the other people you stop? Every day, don't they deserve the same respect?" The questions hit Richard like slaps. Before he could respond, Grace continued, "I don't want special treatment, officer. What I want is a world where no one is judged by their appearance or the car they drive. Now, if you'll excuse me." And with those words, she quickly left the room, leaving Richard alone with thoughts he had never considered before. Upon returning to his patrol car, Richard remained motionless in front of the steering wheel. Grace's words resonated in his mind, challenging beliefs and attitudes he had taken for granted for years. He started the engine, but didn't drive off immediately. In the hospital parking lot, he observed the people coming and going, elderly leaning on canes, mothers with small children, men with expressions of concern, people whom at a checkpoint he would have judged in seconds based solely on appearances. For the first time in his career, Richard Stern wondered how many times he had been wrong. The rest of the day passed like a blur for Richard. He fulfilled his duty mechanically, but something fundamental had changed inside him. When he stopped, a young man on an old motorcycle, he surprised himself by speaking to him with respect, explaining the infraction without the usual condescending tone. The young man, clearly surprised, thanked him before leaving. "Are you sick or what?" Rodriguez asked him during their break. "I've never seen you so considerate." Richard shrugged. "Maybe I'm maturing." "Or maybe that chubby woman from yesterday put a spell on you," joked Rodriguez. "I don't blame you. She had something special in her gaze." Richard felt a twinge of irritation at the comment. "Her name is Grace Henderson," he said firmly. "And she's a nursing technician at Riverside General Hospital." Rodriguez raised his eyebrows, surprised by the unexpected defense. "Whatever you say, partner. Whatever you say." That night, while helping Michael with his homework, Richard thought again about Grace, about how she had reacted to his apologies without resentment, but also without easy concessions. He remembered her words about respect and wondered how many people like her he had treated unjustly over the years. "Dad, why are you so quiet?" asked Michael, interrupting his thoughts. Richard smiled, messing up his son's hair. "I'm thinking about someone who helped us a lot." "A superhero?" asked the boy enthusiastically. Richard nodded slowly. "Something like that, a superhero without a cape." As he tucked Michael in that night, he made a decision. A simple apology to Grace wasn't enough. He needed to do something more meaningful, something that showed that his words at the hospital weren't just to ease his conscience, but the beginning of a real change. The next day, he requested a meeting with Captain Mendoza, his immediate superior. It was time to propose some modifications to the protocols at traffic checkpoints. Captain Mendoza listened with growing astonishment to Richard's proposal. After 20 years of knowing Officer Stern, he would never have expected that it would be him who suggested a workshop on sensitivity and dignified treatment for the traffic department. "Are you sure you're feeling well, Stern?" asked Mendoza, adjusting his glasses to observe him better. "You've never cared much about, what did you call it, the emotional impact of our interventions." Richard maintained a firm gaze. "Things change, Captain. People change, and I believe our department needs this type of training." Mendoza leaned back in his chair, studying the face of the officer who for years had been known as the most inflexible in the unit. "It has to do with that incident at the hospital, right? Rodriguez mentioned something." Richard nodded slowly. "Let's say I had a lesson in humility that made me see things differently." After considering it for a moment, Mendoza agreed, albeit with some skepticism. "All right, Stern. Organize your workshop. But if this is a passing phase," Richard interrupted him. "It's not, Captain. It's the beginning of something necessary." Over the following weeks, Richard immersed himself in organizing the workshop. He contacted psychologists specialized in public service, researched unconscious prejudices, and studied cases of good police practices in other countries. His colleagues observed this change with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The hawk Stern, transformed into an advocate for dignified treatment, was something difficult to assimilate. Meanwhile, Richard tried several times to meet Grace at the hospital, but their schedules never coincided. According to staff, she mainly worked night shifts and had multiple jobs to support her family. This information increased the admiration he was beginning to feel for her. One afternoon after his shift, Richard decided to visit Highland Park. He didn't have Grace's exact address, but he remembered the neighborhood name from the documents he had reviewed. He drove slowly through the narrow streets, observing the simple houses and children playing on the dusty sidewalks. He felt like an intruder in a world different from his own, a world where the daily struggle to survive was more evident. He stopped his car in front of a small grocery store and asked the owner, an older woman named Mrs. Carmen, if she knew Grace Henderson. "The nurse?" "Say, of course," responded the woman with a smile. "That girl is an angel. She lives 3 streets down the greenhouse with the metal gate." Richard thanked her for the information and continued on his way, feeling an inexplicable nervousness. Upon arriving in front of the indicated house, he hesitated. What would he say? How would he explain his presence there? Before he could decide, the door opened, and Grace appeared, dressed in casual clothes, holding shopping bags, while 3 small children ran out around her. Seeing Richard in his car, she stopped in her tracks. Their gazes crossed across the distance. Richard got out of the vehicle slowly, as if any sudden movement could break the fragile connection between them. "Officer Stern," Grace finally said, "what are you doing in my neighborhood?" "I wanted to talk to you," he responded, noting how inadequate those words sounded. "I've tried to find you at the hospital." Grace put the bags on the ground and addressed the children. "Tony, take your siblings inside and tell Grandma we have a visitor." The little ones observed the policeman with curiosity before obeying. "I don't have much time," warned Grace, crossing her arms. "My mother needs her medicines and I have to prepare dinner before going to the night shift." Richard nodded, understanding for the first time how complex this woman's life was. "I'm organizing a workshop on dignified treatment for traffic officers," he said without preamble. "I'd like you to participate, to share your experience." Grace looked at him with surprise. "My experience as a victim of discrimination?" Richard shook his head. "Your experience as someone who maintains dignity, even when others try to take it away. As someone who saves lives without expecting recognition. As someone who teaches by example." The silence that followed was charged with contradictory emotions. Finally, Grace sighed. "Why me, officer? There are many more qualified healthcare professionals with degrees and recognitions." "Because you changed something in me. admitted Richard with an honesty that surprised even himself. "And I believe you can change something in my colleagues, too." Grace carefully observed the officer's face as if looking for signs of falsehood. What she found seemed to convince her. "I'll think about it," she finally said. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have responsibilities to attend to." Richard nodded and prepared to leave, but before getting into his car, he asked, "How is your mother? Does she need anything?" The question disarmed Grace. For the first time, Richard saw that her mask of serenity was cracking, revealing the fatigue and worry she carried inside. "She has advanced diabetes," she responded after a moment. "The medicines are expensive, and insurance doesn't cover everything she needs." Richard remembered the multiple jobs she maintained. "Can I help in some way?" Grace firmly shook her head. "We don't need charity, Officer Stern." "It's not charity," he responded. "It's reciprocity. You saved my son. At least let me—" But she interrupted him. "What I did for your son was my duty as a healthcare professional. I'm not looking for reward or gratitude for it." Richard understood that insisting would be counterproductive. He respected the dignity she so valued and said goodbye with a wave of his hand. During the drive back to his apartment, he couldn't help but compare the simplicity of Grace's house with the comfort of his own home. He remembered her words about not wanting special treatment, but a world where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or social condition. Was it possible to build that world? The workshop was scheduled for the following month. Richard dedicated every free moment to its organization, surprising his colleagues with his commitment. One afternoon, while reviewing the program in the EE station cafeteria, he received a message on his phone. It was from the hospital. Michael had suffered a relapse and had been admitted urgently. Richard drove at full speed, his heart racing frantically. Arriving at the hospital, he found his ex-wife Laura waiting outside the emergency room. "What happened?" he asked, trying to control the panic in his voice. Laura, with eyes reddened from crying, explained that Michael had begun to have difficulty breathing during his physical education class. "The doctors say it could be a sequel to the incident in the pool," she added, avoiding directly mentioning the word drowning. Richard felt the ground moving beneath his feet. Just when he thought everything was behind them, the ghost of that afternoon returned to threaten what he loved most. The following hours passed in an anguished wait. Finally, a doctor came out to inform them that Michael was stable, but would need to remain hospitalized for observation. While Laura went in to see her son, Richard stayed in the hallway, trying to assimilate the news. It was then that he saw Grace at the end of the corridor reviewing some files. Without thinking twice, he approached her. "My son is here," he said with a trembling voice. "He's had a relapse." Grace immediately put down what she was doing. "Michael, what room is he in?" Richard told her, and she headed there without waiting for an invitation. Upon entering, she professionally greeted Laura and began to review the monitors and the clinical history hung at the foot of the bed. Michael, drowsy from medication, smiled weakly upon recognizing her. "You're the lady from the day I fell in the water," murmured the boy. Grace nodded, gently caressing his forehead. "Yes, that's me, and I see you're a very brave fighter." She turned toward Richard and Laura. "His vital signs are good, and his oxygen saturation is improving. I think he'll be fine, but he'll need follow-up." Laura, confused, looked at Richard. "You two know each other?" Richard nodded, not knowing how to explain the complex relationship that had developed between him and Grace. Mrs. Henderson was the one who attended to Michael that day at the club. Grace, professional as always, completed her review of the boy and said goodbye with a promise to come back and check on his condition later. As she left the room, Richard followed her. "Thank you," he said simply. "Do you think he'll be all right?" She nodded with confidence. "He's a strong boy, and these reactions sometimes occur after respiratory trauma. With the proper treatment, he'll recover completely." Richard ran a hand through his hair, visibly relieved. "I don't know what I would have done if—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Grace looked at him with a mixture of understanding and professional firmness. "Don't think about that. Focus on being there for him now." A nurse called Grace to attend to another emergency. Before leaving, she added, "By the way, I've thought about your workshop proposal. I think I'll participate. Richard felt a wave of gratitude. Thank you, it will mean a lot to everyone. She shrugged, downplaying it. I'm doing it for all those who go through checkpoints every day, not just for you or Michael. And with those words, she walked away down the hall, leaving Richard with the certainty that this seemingly casual encounter was destined to change many more lives than just his own. The day of the workshop dawned with a clear sky, as if even the weather wanted to contribute to the change Richard so yearned to promote. The conference room at the police station, normally used for operational meetings and planning checkpoints, looked different. Richard had arrived 2 hours early to place posters with messages about dignity, respect, and public service. On a table at the back, he had arranged coffee, water, and some snacks he had bought himself. As his colleagues arrived, Richard noticed the skeptical looks and whispered comments. Many attended only because Captain Mendoza had made attendance mandatory, but few truly believed in the usefulness of what they called sentimental talks. Rodriguez, who had become an unexpected support during the past few weeks, approached Richard. "Nervous?" he asked, serving himself coffee. "A bit," admitted Richard. "It's important that this works." "It will be difficult to change such ingrained mentalities," commented Rodriguez, discreetly pointing to a group of veterans who were mocking one of the posters. "But if anyone can do it, it's you. The fact that it's precisely the hawk who's promoting this is already a powerful message." Richard thanked him for the comment with a gesture and checked his watch. There were 10 minutes left to start, and Grace still hadn't arrived. She had confirmed her participation the day before, but now Richard feared she might have changed her mind. The invited psychologist, Dr. Valencia, was already preparing his presentation, and Captain Mendoza was observing everything from the entrance with an impenetrable expression. When the clock struck the starting time, Richard decided to begin without Grace. He welcomed the group, briefly explaining the purpose of the workshop and introducing Dr. Valencia, who would start with a talk on unconscious biases in public service. Just as the psychologist was taking the floor, the door opened and Grace entered, visibly agitated. She had her hair pulled back, wore a simple skirt with a blue blouse, and her cheeks were flushed from hurrying. "Sorry for the delay," she murmured as she looked for a seat. The bus was late. Several officers observed her with curiosity, recognizing her as the protagonist of the rumors circulating about Stern's change in attitude. Richard indicated a reserved place in the first row and thanked her with a gesture for her presence. The first part of the workshop proceeded without incident. Dr. Valencia spoke about how prejudices affect our daily interactions, especially in positions of authority. He used concrete examples of police situations, managing to capture the attention even of the most skeptical. After a brief recess, it was time for Grace's participation. Richard introduced her with carefully chosen words. "Many of you wonder why we're conducting this workshop. The answer lies in stories like the one Mrs. Henderson will share with us, a story that taught me that behind every person we stop at a checkpoint, there's a complete life we know nothing about." Grace stood up and walked to the front. For a moment, she seemed intimidated by all the eyes fixed on her, but she took a deep breath and began to speak in a serene voice. "I'm not here to complain or point fingers," she clarified from the beginning. "I'm here because I believe we all deserve to be treated with dignity, regardless of our appearance or social condition." She then recounted her encounter with Richard at the checkpoint, omitting neither the hurtful comments nor her own humiliation. She described how, despite having recognized the father of the child she had saved the night before, she chose to maintain her dignity in silence. "I didn't say anything because I didn't want special treatment," she explained. "If I deserve respect, it's not because I saved a child, but because I'm a human being." Her words resonated in the room with unexpected force. Even the most reluctant officers seemed to reflect on what they were hearing. Grace continued talking about her life, her sick mother, the nephews in her care, the multiple jobs to make ends meet, and how, despite everything, she strived to maintain her commitment to her profession and her patients. "When you stop someone at a checkpoint," she concluded, "you're not just facing a driver or a vehicle. You're facing a complete story with struggles, dreams, and responsibilities that you know nothing about. Remembering that can make a huge difference. When Grace finished her intervention, a profound silence invaded the room. It was Captain Mendoza who broke that silence with applause, soon joined by all those present. Richard observed with emotion how even the toughest officers seemed moved by the testimony. The workshop continued with a series of practical exercises where officers had to analyze everyday situations from different perspectives. At the end, many approached Grace to thank her for her sincerity and courage. Richard waited for the room to empty to speak with her. "Thank you," he said with a gratitude that went far beyond her participation in the workshop. "Your words reached where they needed to." Grace smiled, for the first time without reservations. "I hope they generate real changes." "They will," promised Richard. "Starting with me." A comfortable silence settled between them, as if they had exhausted the necessary words. Finally, Richard dared to ask, "Would you like to have coffee, to properly thank you for everything?" Grace seemed to hesitate. "I have to pick up my nephews in an hour." "The coffee shop is close by," he insisted. "It will be quick." She finally nodded. "All right, a quick coffee." The cafe was a simple but welcoming place, mainly frequented by workers from the hospital and the police station. Richard and Grace sat at a table by the window, from where they could see Riverside's Central Park. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily, moving away from workshop topics to delve into more personal aspects. Richard talked about Michael, his divorce, and how he had taken refuge in his work until becoming someone he didn't recognize. Grace shared stories about her nephews, her decision to stay in the city when her sister emigrated, and her dreams of someday completing her university studies to become a registered nurse. "Why haven't you done it?" asked Richard. Grace shrugged. "Life had other plans. My mother got sick, my sister left, and someone had to take care of the children." "You're admirable," said Richard sincerely. Grace shook her head. "There's nothing admirable about doing what needs to be done. Millions of women do the same every day. But not all do it while maintaining the dignity and compassion you show," he insisted. A slight blush covered Grace's cheeks, and she looked away toward her coffee cup. "Speaking of Michael," she said, changing the subject, "how is he doing?" "Much better. The doctors say he'll be able to return to his normal activities in a week." Richard hesitated a moment before adding, "He'd like to thank you personally. He asks about you every time we go to the hospital." "Have you told him about how you saved him?" "Yes. About how I treated you afterward." "Not exactly. I just told him we met at a checkpoint and you were very kind." Grace nodded, understanding. The omission. Children don't need to carry the mistakes of adults. The conversation continued and the quick coffee extended for almost 2 hours. When Grace looked at her watch and was startled to see the time, Richard offered to take her, to pick up her nephews. "It's not necessary," she said, hastily gathering her purse. "I can take the bus." "I insist," said Richard. "It's the least I can do." Grace finally accepted. During the journey in Richard's car, a comfortable silence settled between them. Upon arriving at the school where Grace's nephews studied, Richard was surprised to see it was the same one Michael attended. "Your nephews study here?" he asked, parking the vehicle. "Yes, thanks to a scholarship we got. It's a good school." The children were waiting at the entrance. Anthony, 10 years old, Sophie, 8, and little Daniel, 6. Seeing Grace getting out of a patrol car, they ran toward her with a mixture of curiosity and alarm. "Are you in trouble, Aunt Grace?" asked Anthony, looking suspiciously at Richard. Grace laughed, messing up the boy's hair. "Of course not. Officer Stern is a friend who's helping me." The children observed Richard with curiosity as he introduced himself. Sophie, the most extroverted, immediately asked, "Do you have a real gun?" before Grace could scold her for the indiscretion. "Sophie, you don't ask that," said Grace, embarrassed. Richard smiled. "It's okay. Yes, I have one, but I only use it when absolutely necessary. Part of my job is to protect people like you." The children seemed fascinated, especially when Richard showed them his badge. Grace observed the scene with an indefinable expression, as if she were seeing Richard in a completely new light. "We should go," she finally said. "I have a shift at the hospital tonight, and I still need to prepare dinner." "May I drive you?" offered Richard. "It's no trouble." Grace was going to refuse, but Anthony intervened enthusiastically. "Yes, we've never ridden in a patrol car." The other children joined the request, and Grace found herself yielding to their enthusiasm. "All right, but just this once." The journey to Grace's house was filled with childish questions about police work, which Richard answered with patience and humor. Upon arrival, the children ran inside to tell their grandmother about their adventure in the patrol car. Richard and Grace stayed for a moment on the porch. "Thank you for bringing us," she said, "and for being so patient with their questions." "They're lovely children," he responded. "It's clear you've raised them well." Grace smiled with pride. "I do what I can." For a moment, both remained silent, as if neither wanted to end the encounter. Finally, Richard spoke. "I'd like to invite you and the children to a barbecue next Sunday. Michael will be there, and I think he'd like to meet your nephews." The proposal took Grace by surprise. "A barbecue?" "Yes, at my house. Nothing formal, just hamburgers and sodas. The children could swim in the pool." At the mention of the pool, both immediately remembered the incident with Michael. Richard quickly added, "I'll be watching the whole time, of course." Grace hesitated. "I don't know if it's appropriate." "Just as friends," clarified Richard, "to thank you for everything you've done for us." After a moment of reflection, Grace nodded. "All right, the children will love the idea of a pool, but it will have to be at noon. I have a shift in the afternoon." "Perfect," said Richard, unable to hide his joy. "We'll expect you at noon." They said goodbye with a gesture, both aware that something important had changed between them. They were no longer simply the arrogant policeman and the humiliated nurse, not even the grateful father and the savior of his son. They were two people discovering each other mutually, with all their complexities and contradictions. As Richard drove away in his patrol car, Grace remained on the porch, watching the vehicle until it disappeared around the corner. For the first time in a long time, she felt an emotion she had almost forgotten: hope. Sunday dawned with a radiant sun that seemed to bless the gathering Richard had organized with such care. Since early morning, he had dedicated himself to preparing his house to receive Grace and her family. He cleaned the pool, arranged the garden, and set up the grill. Michael, excited by the idea of meeting the woman who had saved him and her nephews, helped his father by placing plates and glasses on the patio table. "Do you think they'll like our house, Dad?" asked the boy, meticulously arranging the cutlery. "I'm sure they will," responded Richard, surprised by his son's unusual concern about making a good impression. "Why do you ask?" Michael shrugged. "Mrs. Grace saved my life. I want her to feel good here." Richard crouched down to be at his son's eye level and looked at him with pride. "You're a very special boy, did you know that?" At 12 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Richard, who until that moment hadn't felt nervous, experienced a sudden flutter in his stomach. He quickly glanced at himself in the hallway mirror, adjusted his casual shirt, and opened the door with a smile. Grace was there, wearing a simple summer dress that Richard had never seen her in before. Next to her, the three children wore their best clothes and held a homemade cake. Behind them, to Richard's surprise, an elderly woman in a wheelchair completed the family picture. "I hope you don't mind," said Grace, noticing his look. "My mother insisted on coming. She wanted to meet the man I've been talking about so much lately." Richard felt an inexplicable warmth at the idea that Grace had been talking about him with her family. "Of course I don't mind. It's an honor. Please, all of you come in." Martha, Grace's mother, was a kind-faced woman marked by years and illness, but with lively eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around her. She shook Richard's hand with surprising firmness. "So you're the famous officer," she said with an enigmatic smile. "My daughter says you're trying to change how the police treat citizens." "I'm trying to, ma'am," Richard responded sincerely, "though the road is long." "Long roads are the only ones worth traveling," the woman stated. Michael appeared shyly from the garden. Seeing him, Grace smiled and approached him. "You must be Michael. How are you feeling?" "Good, thank you," replied the boy, looking at her with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "My dad says you saved me." "I was just doing my job," responded Grace, gently stroking his hair, "and from what I can see, I did it well. You're strong and healthy." Grace's nephews, who had remained quiet until that moment, perked up at the sight of another child. Soon Michael was leading them through the house, showing them his toys and, of course, the pool they had been so eager to see. The adults settled on the patio, where Richard began preparing the hamburgers. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they had known each other for years. Martha shared stories of when Grace was little, making her blush on more than one occasion. "She was always like this, you know," the elderly woman commented to Richard, "always thinking of others before herself. Even as a child, when her father left us, she was only 12 years old and already behaving like an adult, helping me with the house and her siblings." Richard looked at Grace with growing admiration. Each story, each detail he learned about her, increased his respect, and he had to admit his feelings for her. While the children played under the strict supervision of both adults, neither forgot the incident that had triggered this whole story. Richard and Grace talked about the changes the workshop had generated at the police station. "Rodriguez told me that several officers are applying the new guidelines for dignified treatment," explained Richard, "even the most skeptical ones, and Captain Mendoza is considering making the workshop a regular activity for all departments." Grace smiled with satisfaction. It's incredible how a personal experience can generate such significant changes. "Sometimes, we need to experience something firsthand to understand its importance," reflected Richard, "or meet someone who makes us see it." Their eyes met briefly, communicating something that went beyond words. After the meal, while Martha rested in a shaded armchair and the children played with a ball in the garden, they had decided to wait a bit longer before using the pool. Richard and Grace were left alone clearing the table. "Thank you for inviting us," she said. "The children are delighted. It's been a while since I've seen them so happy." "Thank you for coming," he replied, "and for bringing your mother. She's an admirable woman." "She is. She's fought all her life, and yet she maintains her spirit and her sense of humor." Richard hesitated a moment before asking, "What happened with her treatment? Is insurance still not covering everything she needs?" Grace sighed. "We've had some progress. A doctor friend has helped us include her in a special program, but it's still difficult. The medicines are expensive, and my sister in another state can't always send money." "I'd like to help," said Richard. "And before you say you don't need charity, that's not what I'm offering." Grace looked at him curiously. "Then what?" "Rodriguez's brother works in the state government's social services department. There are support programs for people with chronic illnesses like diabetes. I could talk to him to review your mother's case." Grace's eyes lit up. "Would you do that?" "Of course. It's the right thing to do, not just for what you did for Michael, but because your mother deserves the best possible care." In an impulsive gesture that surprised them both, Grace took Richard's hand and squeezed it gently. "Thank you." The contact, though brief, sent an electric current through Richard's arm. They looked at each other, aware that something was changing between them. A joyful shout from the garden broke the moment. The children were asking permission to finally use the pool. The afternoon passed amid laughter, splashing, and the warmth of a gathering that seemed predestined. Richard observed how Grace played with the children, including Michael, who seemed to have completely overcome his fear of water. Martha, from her chair, gestured for him to come closer. "My daughter has suffered a lot," she said without preamble when Richard sat beside her. "She's given up many things to take care of us, first her siblings and now me and the children." "I know," responded Richard. "She's an extraordinary woman." The elderly woman studied him with a penetrating gaze. "I see how you look at her, officer, and I must admit it worries me, not because of you but because of her. Grace doesn't know how to defend herself from the heart the way she does from humiliations." Richard nodded, understanding the maternal concern. "I don't intend to hurt her, ma'am. On the contrary, she has taught me something that no police training could. the value of human dignity. Martha smiled, apparently satisfied with the response. Then perhaps I shouldn't worry so much, but remember, wounds of the soul take longer to heal than those of the body. When the sun began to set, Grace announced they had to leave. She had a shift at the hospital that night and needed to prepare. The children protested, wanting to stay longer, but finally yielded to Richard's promise that there would be more gatherings like this one. "Anthony can come play with us whenever he wants," offered Michael, who had developed a quick friendship with Grace's oldest nephew. "And you too, Officer Richard." Richard laughed at the title. "Thank you, Anthony, and you all are always welcome here." While helping Martha into the taxi he had called, her house wasn't accessible for the wheelchair. Richard approached Grace. "It's been a wonderful day," he said. "I'd like it to happen again." Grace smiled. "The children would love it, and my mother too." "And you?" Richard dared to ask. Grace looked at him directly, with the honesty that had always been her most distinctive characteristic. "Me too, Richard. More than I probably should." Before he could respond, she got into the taxi with her mother. The children would follow in Richard's car, as he had offered to drive them home. During the journey, he watched in the rearview mirror as the three little ones enthusiastically exchanged impressions about the day. Michael, seated beside him, looked happy and tired. "I really like them, Dad," he commented. "Especially Mrs. Grace. She's very kind." "Yes, she is," responded Richard thoughtfully. "She's a very special person." Upon arriving at Grace's house, the children ran out to tell their aunt and grandmother how well they had behaved. Richard and Michael followed more slowly. On the porch, before saying goodbye, Richard took courage. "Grace, I was wondering if—" He hesitated, something unusual for him. "If you would like to have dinner with me sometime, just us. I'd like to get to know you better." Grace seemed surprised but not uncomfortable. "A date?" she asked directly. "Yes," admitted Richard. "A date?" She smiled slightly. "It would have to be when my mother can stay with the children, and between my hospital shifts." "I'll wait as long as necessary," assured Richard. With a shy but determined gesture, Grace leaned in and softly kissed his cheek. "I'll call you," she promised. Back home, Michael bombarded his father with questions about whether they would soon see Grace and her nephews again. Richard, with a smile he couldn't contain, assured him they would. That night, as he tucked his son in, Michael made an observation that left him thoughtful. "Dad, since you've known Mrs. Grace, you smile more. I like seeing you like that." At the hospital, Grace began her shift with renewed energy. Her colleague Carmen, noticing her good mood, commented, "Something good has happened to you, right? I haven't seen you smile like this since. I can't remember when." Grace merely shrugged, but she couldn't help her mind returning to the moment when Richard had invited her to dinner. In the days that followed, Richard not only kept his promise to speak with Rodriguez's brother about Martha's case, but personally accompanied her to medical appointments and necessary paperwork. The government support program was approved, and soon Grace's mother began receiving the complete treatment she needed. This gesture deeply impressed Grace, who saw in it not just gratitude for having saved Michael, but a genuine commitment to her family's well-being. The promised dinner turned into several, first at simple restaurants, then walks in the park, visits to the cinema, and long conversations where both discovered how much they had in common, despite their different backgrounds and circumstances. To everyone's surprise at the police station, Richard requested a transfer to the community program, where he could work more closely with citizens instead of just issuing fines and sanctions. Captain Mendoza, though initially skeptical, approved the request upon seeing the positive results that Stern's change in attitude had generated throughout the department. "I never thought I'd say this," commented Rodriguez during a break, "but you're an example to follow, Stern. You've changed the way many of us see our job." Richard smiled. "It wasn't me. It was a woman who had the courage to maintain her dignity when I tried to take it away." The community program led Richard to collaborate with schools and health centers, including Riverside General Hospital, where Grace worked. This coincidence allowed them to see each other more frequently, And soon it was evident to everyone that something more than friendship had developed between them. Grace's nephews and Michael became inseparable companions, and Martha, to her daughter's surprise, transformed into one of Richard's greatest advocates. "I never thought I'd say this about a policeman," the elderly woman confessed one afternoon, when Richard had again invited them to his house. "But you're a good man. You've brought joy to our family." 6 months after the fateful encounter at the checkpoint, a special ceremony was organized at Riverside City Hall. The mayor had decided to publicly recognize exemplary citizens who, through small daily actions, positively transformed the community. Among those honored were Grace, for her dedication as a nursing technician beyond the call of duty, and Richard, for promoting the dignified treatment program in the municipal police, now replicated in other cities across the state. During the Tanti ceremony, seated next to each other, their hands discreetly met. "Who would have thought we'd end up like this?" whispered Grace. "That day at the checkpoint, all I wanted was to get away from you as quickly as possible." Richard smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "And I was so blind that I couldn't see the extraordinary person in front of me." "It's never too late to learn to truly see," she responded. At the end of the ceremony, as photographers and journalists recorded the event, someone asked for a photo of Richard and Grace together. Without thinking twice, he put his arm around her waist in a protective and loving gesture. The image, captured by a local photographer, showed not just two exemplary citizens, but two people whose lives had become intertwined in an unexpected and meaningful way. That photo appeared the next day on the front page of the local newspaper, with a headline that perfectly summarized their story: "From humiliation to respect. How a chance encounter transformed 2 lives and an entire community." The article briefly told their story, quickly becoming one of the most shared on social media. Hundreds of comments praised Richard's transformation and Grace's dignity, inspiring conversations about dignified treatment in public services and the importance of not judging people by their appearance. One night, as they watched the stars from the patio of Richard's house after a family dinner, he took Grace's hand. The children played inside, supervised by Martha, who had notably improved with her new treatment. "I'll never thank you enough," said Richard. "Not just for saving Michael, but for saving me too." Grace looked at him curiously. "Saving you? From becoming someone incapable of seeing the humanity in others, from forgetting why I chose to be a police officer in the first place. You reminded me that behind every person, there's a story that deserves respect." "You taught me something too," responded Grace, "that people can change when given the opportunity, that we shouldn't lock them into the first impression they give us." Richard slowly leaned in, and for the first time kissed her under the starry sky of Riverside, a kiss that sealed not just the beginning of a love story, but the shared commitment to build a world where dignity and respect were the foundation of all human relationships. And so, what began as an unfortunate encounter at a police checkpoint was transformed into a story of redemption, love, and hope. A story that reminded everyone that we never know when our paths will cross with someone destined to change our life forever. A story that, like so many others in America and around the world, reminds us that true human greatness lies not in power or authority, but in the ability to recognize our own humanity in others. Dear listeners, we hope that this story of Richard and Grace has moved you as much as it moved us in creating it. 2 lives that intertwine unexpectedly, reminding us that behind every face there's a complete story, deserving of respect and dignity. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special series with equally captivating stories about encounters that transform lives. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this narrative about the power of dignity and personal transformation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Each week we bring new American stories that explore the richness and complexity of our human relationships. What do you think about Richard's transformation? Have you experienced something that changed your way of seeing the world? We look forward to your comments to share your own stories of redemption and change. Until next time, with more stories that touch the heart and transform the soul.